The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. My guest today is Simon LeVay, a British neuroscientist who's been on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the Salk Institute in San Diego. He's best known for a 1991 study in which he reported on a difference in brain structure between gay and straight men. The study helped kickstart a wealth of new research on the biology of sexual orientation. He summarizes the current state of the field in his book, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, which has just appeared in paperback. Dr. LeVay is now a full-time writer, and he lives in West Hollywood, California. Wonderful to have you here, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. Just a tiny correction of what you just said. Yes, I was born British, but now I'm as American as anyone else. I've been an American citizen for about 30 years now.
Patriotism. Thank you, sir.
There you go.
So before we get started, I have to ask about the response to this kind of research, and not just yours, but research in this field. Is it considered controversial?
It certainly was when I initially published my study about differences in brain structure between gay and straight men. That was actually in 1991. It's probably become less so now, certainly among scientists. I think there's now such a sort of weight of evidence that, it really is useful to look at sexual orientation with biological tools, such as, brain structure and so forth. But it does remain somewhat controversial, particularly, among people who are more sort of anti-gay. They have a difficulty digesting this sort of work. They often see it as somewhat threatening to their point of view.
So I assume that's because of the potential societal implications.
Yes. I mean, I think, traditionally, as anti-gay feelings have often been rooted in the concept that there's nothing more to homosexuality than straight people saying to themselves, I think I'll try that gay thing this weekend, something like that. And, the science really doesn't support that. The science, whatever the details of the science, generally speaking, the science points in the direction that being gay is really a pretty central aspect of your nature that you don't easily, put on or take off, so to speak.
Well, it's definitely still a difficult topic for some people to wrap their heads around. So maybe to help, let's define some terms. What does sexual orientation refer to? Well,
the way I use it is to mean a person's previous position to be attracted to members of the same sex or members of the opposite sex or members of both sexes, homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual. Some people have used it to refer to behavior, people's actual sexual experience with same-sex or opposite-sex partners. But nowadays that's less common because people realize that sexual behavior is very a fluid thing. You can that depends a lot on what's happening, what partners are available and so forth. And people's underlying attractions to one sex or the other seems to be a more sort of core aspect of who you are.
Well, what kind of factors would influence the choice of sex partners?
Well, in terms of people's actual choice of who they have sex with, all sorts of things. First of all, of course, your basic sexual orientation, who you're sexually attracted to. But then also, what's available. If you might be in a single-sex environment, such as a prison, then you might engage in sex with same-sex partners, even if you're basically heterosexual. There might also be factors working the other way, like you might have moral reservations about engaging in same-sex behavior, so that even if you're basically gay, you might get married and have children just because you think it's the right thing to do, or because perhaps you want to have children and be sort of, a sort of, quote, normal person in society. So there are many factors that influence the relationships you get into that don't necessarily tie in with your basic, attractions to one sex or the other.
So then if one wanted to do research on sexual orientation, for example, you'd have to create categories. So are there specific criteria for considering someone straight or gay?
Well, usually, the way you do it is simply ask them. Sometimes people are asked to put themselves on a scale, where this would be, for example, the Kinsey scale, back in the 1940s. Alfred Kinsey laid out the scale whereby a 0 would be only sexually attracted to persons of the other sex, and 6 would be only attracted to persons of the same sex as yourself. And the other numbers would be various degrees of bisexuality. So, and you just ask people, what they're attracted to. Now, there are other ways you can do it. You can look at sexual arousal physiologically by, for example, with men, measuring erection of the penis while the man is looking at erotic images of males or females. And you can do equivalent things with women where you measure basically the genital arousal. But I think the most common way is simply to ask people about their sexual attractions.
Now, you wrote about the self-reported studies on sexual attraction. Are there any problems with those kind of studies?
Yeah, yes, and people sometimes might be reluctant to answer honestly, because after all, being gay is, at least in some quarters, still a stigmatized orientation. And historically, some of these surveys have come out with numbers that are kind of on the low side in terms of the numbers of people who identify as gay or lesbian. So that may be because people just aren't willing to, be completely forthcoming. So that would be a problem with that kind of approach. That seems to be going away at this point. I think, nowadays most people are fairly willing to be honest about their sexual feelings as long as they are, confident that this information is being taken in confidence.
So then, according to those studies, what percentage of the population is gay?
Well, it's not 10%. This was a number that had been floating around for many years. People say, 10% of the population is gay. And that's not true. The actual numbers, from different surveys vary a bit. But I would say, 4 or 5% for men are completely gay. And less than that, maybe 2 or 3% of women are exclusively lesbian, exclusively attracted to other women. But the interesting difference between men and women comes when you look at the shape of the curve, so to speak. Men really fall in two groups. A lot of heterosexual men, a smaller number of gay men, and an even smaller number of men in the middle. There are bisexual men, definitely, but they're relatively few, even compared with the numbers of gay men. But with women, it's quite different. You have a lot of heterosexual women, small numbers of completely homosexual or lesbian women, and quite a lot of women in those intermediate groups. Quite a lot of women who don't identify, who say basically they have some degree of sexual attraction to both sexes. So bisexuality is much more common among women than it is among men.
And why would that be?
That's a good question we don't have the answer to. I suspect that it has something to do with biological processes that go on during early development. There's something about the way the brain develops in men and women that's quite different. I think there are basically inhibitory circuits in male brains as they develop that tend to produce a sort of all or none results, so that you end up with black or white, so to speak, whereas in women you have more shades of gray. But the actual sort of biological details of that are not really understood. And some people think it's not for that kind of biological reason. Some people think that there are social reasons that force men to join one group or the other, and which doesn't operate to the same degree in women. So that's an unanswered question, really.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. We're talking to neuroscientist Simon LeVay about his book, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why. So you mentioned the sexual arousal studies. Do tell.
These studies that have been done by, for example, Michael Bailey and Meredith Chivers at Northwestern, these simply measure genital arousal in men by measuring the erection of the penis, in women by measuring blood flow, usually in the genitals. And they're usually done by showing the subject erotic videos that might be of males or of females. And you simply measure, how much the person's genitals respond when the person is viewing those images. And you might also ask them at the same time, are you, psychologically aroused by these images? And in men, it's very simple. Most men, the great majority of men, will show genital arousal to either males or females. Actually, most obviously will respond to images of females. And very few actually will respond with genital arousal to both sexes. Some do, but they're quite hard to find, actually. You have to really search for individuals who show such bisexual responses. With women, genital responses are much less specific, if you like. Most women actually will respond to erotic images of either males or females, actually regardless of how the women identify as lesbian or straight. And actually, women's genital responses don't correspond very well to how they think they are aroused or not. Their psychological arousal, in other words, doesn't necessarily match very well what's going on in their genitals. So it looks as if sexual orientation in women is more complex, it's more high-level kind of phenomenon, if you like, whereas in men it seems rather low-level, tied into, to put it sort of almost cynically, it's as if a man can figure out his sexual orientation by consulting his penis. And that's definitely not the case that a woman can figure out her sexual orientation by consulting her vulva, by consulting her genitals.
I may use that in conversation. So do these kind of results differ across cultures?
I don't think that's really known, because these genital arousal studies have really only been done in Western countries, So I don't think you could, anyone's gone into the Amazonian jungle, and said, "Do you mind if I put a little blood pressure cuff on your penis and show you some photographs?" That's something that should be done, but it would be a brave anthropologist who would undertake that sort of work. So, in fact, I don't think even in Asian countries, I don't think these studies have been done yet. So it would be interesting to do. I mean, the reason that it would be interesting is, of course, the concepts of like gay and lesbian and heterosexual are really Western concepts. I mean, there are many cultures where even the terms don't exist, So the question about whether homosexuality and heterosexuality and bisexuality, whether they're really sort of Western terms or whether they're more universal terms or concepts, is not really resolved. I myself think that the underlying phenomena probably are universal, but there are only some cultures in which people, think about it and use words to describe these different orientations.
Well, I assume that has an effect on research then.
The research on the topic has nearly entirely been done in Western cultures, although there are some people, there are some sociologists who've gone into a variety of other cultures and do report that they find both, gay and straight individuals, basically. But they don't have, the numbers. There aren't really surveys in non-Western cultures to tell us, what fraction of the population might be gay or straight. Since we're talking about, anthropology, I should say that in many cultures, there are men who are not typically masculine, who are to some degree feminine or intermediate in their sort of gender role, if you like. And this has been recognized in many cultures. In Native American cultures, there are these individuals who would be called berdache or two-spirit individuals. And throughout Polynesia, there are characters who are given names like Frafafine. That means men who are feminine. And typically, these are very feminine men who are sexually attracted to males. And people like that exist, obviously, in the West also. But there also exist men who are fairly conventionally masculine, who are sexually attracted to males.
Right.
As also there exist women who are fairly, typically feminine in their general sort of social appearance, who are nevertheless sexually attracted to other women. So it doesn't seem necessarily that, to be gay or lesbian, you have to be extremely feminine man or extremely masculine woman. I mean, these people definitely do exist, but that's not the entire story of homosexuality, if you like.
And that's also one of the things that sort of makes it difficult sometimes to research these kind of topics.
That's absolutely true, because some people imagine gay men only as the very feminine identified gay men who are obviously recognizable as gay, as soon as they open their mouth, if you like, and vice versa for lesbians. But there's many more gay people who are not nearly as obvious, if you like, and those are people who need to be included and studied too.
We have a question from the website, from Lee.
Are we all just a few specific experiences away from homosexuality or bisexuality? Do we all have the potential for willing homosexual activity?
In some sense, yes. I mean, if you throw a heterosexual man or woman into a same-sex environment and don't give them access to opposite-sex partners, they often will sort of discover aspects of themselves that really they weren't aware of. For example, men in prison, that's one case. And also men who are gay, like myself, for example. I mean, I've had sexual relationships with women, and I'm capable of performing with women. They don't turn me on in the same way that men do, but nevertheless, I and most gay men can function in that kind of heterosexual relationship. So it's not like, being gay or lesbian means you're completely incapable of responding sexually in a heterosexual situation. And conversely, being completely heterosexual doesn't mean you're incapable of appreciating beauty, let's say, in same-sex partners and actually engaging in sex. So humans are pretty flexible, actually, in their sexuality.
Well, you did mention the Kinsey scale. So is that still valid at this point?
The Kinsey scale is the 7-point scale of sexual attraction. And yeah, it's still valid, but most researchers actually use a sort of simpler scale, like a 5-point scale, just because Kinsey's scale is a little bit too detailed. If you ask people to put themselves on a 7-point scale, then they sort of start worrying, am I really 2 or 3, or am I, 5 or 6? And it just gets a little too sort of specific, a little too detailed. So people often just are satisfied with a 5-point, or even sometimes a 3-point scale, heterosexual, bisexual, or gay.
God, humans will worry about anything.
Yes, definitely.
And we'll be right back to talk about the book Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why with author Simon LeVay after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. To be a part of the discussion, call and record your question on our listener question line at Speak 73101. That's 773-257-3101. Long-distance charges may apply. Sunday nights at 6 Mountain Time, join our Ustream chat room to listen and ask questions as we record interviews live. Just click the Listen Online button at skepticallyspeaking.com. You can also email your questions and comments to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, tweet us at Skeptical Radio. To find out where Skeptically Speaking airs near you, to listen to past episodes, or download the weekly podcast, check out our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. While you're there, follow the links to connect with us on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or to subscribe to the show in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm here with Simon LeVay, a neuroscientist who helped kickstart a wealth of new research on the biology of sexual orientation. He's the author of Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, and it just appeared in paperback. So the question that really attracts all the attention is why, of course. What determines sexual orientation? And there are a number of different non-biological theories floating around. Tell us about those.
The non-biological theories, yes. Well, the most famous one, of course, is Freud's theories. The idea that it's the way that parents interact with their young children that steers a child ultimately towards being straight or gay. And, the examples he gave, the particular kind of situation that he focused on with regard to men was the idea that a father who was distant or hostile, or a mother who was too sort of close binding towards her son, her young son, I'm talking about a very young child at this point, would cause a child to be stuck in what was called this Oedipal relationship with the parents, such that the son would be too sort of sexually entangled with his mother and would end up as a gay man. So this idea, and there were actually comparable Freudian ideas with regard to girls, often involving things like penis envy or jealousy of an older brother, various factors like that. And these ideas were really dominant throughout the 20th century, such that many gay people, particularly gay men, underwent lengthy courses of psychoanalysis where they were helped to relive these early traumatic experiences with their parents, these supposed, relationships. I don't really think there was much truth to it, but this is what, people thought back then. And by living through this material, they were supposed to be able to perhaps to come out, on the other side as heterosexual adults. I don't think it ever happened. I don't think anyone was ever cured through psychoanalysis. And when I say cured, of course, that's very much in quotation marks, because I don't think that that homosexuality is a disorder that needs to be cured. But this was, these were the Freudian ideas back then. And there have been many other ideas, behavioral ideas, the idea that, it's a learning process, that somehow you're steered towards heterosexuality or homosexuality by thousands of sort of tiny rewards and punishments that parents and teachers and society in general hands out to you as you grow up. These are these sort of social explanations that were once very prevalent and I think now have sort of faded into the background.
Well, and choice is definitely a non-biological theory.
Choice, yes. Well, I mean, of course, I don't deny that choice is very important in our sexuality, not so much at the level of our sexual feelings. I don't think anyone chooses to be sexually attracted to males or females or both. But we do have a tremendous amount of choice in terms of what we do with those feelings. Do we act on them? Do we deny them? What kind of relationships do we get into? Do we come out as gay or not? How do we identify? So choice is very important in actually all the aspects of sexual orientation that are socially important. The aspects that society sees involve a lot of choice. But I don't think there's any choice in the underlying direction of our sexual attractions. Certainly, very few gay people, I think almost no gay men and relatively few lesbian women believe that choice has much to do with their underlying sexual orientation.
So, as you wrote in the book, there are many problems with all of these theories. So that leads us to looking at biological causes then. Now, there have been childhood studies done in this area. So are there childhood traits that are linked to adult sexual orientation?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the original study was simply asking adults, both gay and straight, men and women, what were you like as a kid? And those studies showed pretty clearly that gay men report their childhoods as being, somewhat unmasculine or even perhaps somewhat feminine compared with men who are heterosexual. And conversely, lesbians tend to report their childhoods as being a little more masculine, perhaps in the sense of being more interested in rough and tumble sports, more competitive, perhaps less interested in things like doll play and so forth, than women who are heterosexual. Now, these are, very much averages. It's not the case that every gay man has that childhood or every lesbian has that childhood, but if you interview a lot of people, you see that stand out quite clearly in the data. Now, you can criticize this sort of study because people are, looking way back into their childhoods, and they may misremember their childhood, or they may actually sort of reinvent their childhood a little bit to fit in with how they perceive themselves now. And in fact, there's reason to think that people may do that to some extent. So the way recently researchers have tried to get around that is, for example, by asking gay and straight adults, do you have some home videos of yourself when you were a kid? And these studies, particularly there's a study by Gerolf Rieger and his colleagues at Northwestern University, have shown very clearly that the children who become gay and children who become straight are different. What the researchers did is take short clips from these videos, which showed the children doing fairly, ordinary things, like walking around, playing, and so forth. When these videos were shown to judges who were gay and straight adults who didn't know what the sexual orientation of these children eventually turned out to be, what they found was that the boys who became gay adults, they rated them as much less masculine than the boys who became straight adults. And conversely, the girls who became lesbians were on average much less feminine and more masculine than the girls who became heterosexual women. So there really is some sense in which kids who become gay adults are a little bit gender nonconformist, or even a lot gender nonconformist during childhood, even though no one knows at that point what their future sexual orientation is going to be. So I think this is a kind of indication that being gay and being lesbian is not just who we love, so to speak. It's not just who we're sexually attracted to. It's really a part of a larger package, if you like, of gender nonconformist traits that are already obvious in childhood and it could extend to some extent even into adult life. So when you're asking, what makes people gay or straight, you're really asking, what is influencing this whole package of gender nonconformist traits? Why are people different, not just in their sexual orientation, but in a whole sort of bunch of traits that can be studied and measured?
Has anybody studied how this manifests in transgendered people? Do their childhood traits match their societally assigned gender or their self-identified gender?
Most transgendered people are already pretty transgendered in childhood, so even more so than regular gay people, let's say. So many people, particularly transsexuals, that is people who want to actually change sex from their birth sex to the other sex, they have a childhood history of being extremely gender nonconformist, usually saying they want, a boy might say he wants to be a girl, he prefers to wear girls' clothes, play with girls' toys, and play with girls. He may actually insist he is a girl, even though, to all appearances, he's a boy. And so I think that transgender people and transsexuals in particular, those who really want to change sex physically, are at the extreme of a continuum, let's say, in which gay people, gay men and lesbians, are more in the sort of no man's land, if you like, in between, not like regular heterosexual people, but also not at the extreme degree of gender nonconformity that you see in transgendered and transsexual men and women.
And we have another question on sort of that topic from the chat from Roxy.
How do you measure sexuality when a man or a woman has a sex change? Is a transgendered person still gay if they prefer the same sex?
That question is a very good question. It points out that there's a shortcoming in these words homosexual and heterosexual. I actually prefer to use terms, different terms. I use the terms androphilic and gynophilic, where androphilic means attracted to males and gynophilic means attracted to females. Because when you're talking about transsexual people who change sex, it gets so confusing if you use words like homosexual. Somebody born a boy who becomes a woman later in life because that's what he wants to be, he may be sexually attracted to males, so you might want to call him homosexual with regard to his birth sex, but he probably doesn't identify as homosexual. He probably identifies as a heterosexual woman. So it's kind of easier to call him androphilic, and that's something, he'd probably be comfortable with. He or she, as she later becomes, is sexually attracted to males throughout his or her life. So these terms, homosexual and heterosexual, get sort of uncomfortable when you're talking about people who actually change sex.
This is Skeptically Speaking, and my guest today is neuroscientist Simon LeVay. We're discussing his book, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why. So you mentioned adults and specific traits. Are there actually traits that gay adults share? And also, are we worried about stereotyping an entire group of people?
Yes, we are. We are definitely worried about stereotyping. Anyone who is gay, like myself, has been through taunting and stuff, during childhood or teenage years, where the basis of the taunting is often, that you're named as being a person of the other sex. Gay men may be, called Queenie, for example. Lesbians may be referred to as butch or something like that, in a way that's supposed to be, rather negative. So you have to be careful when you're talking about these stereotypes. I think that these stereotypes have a kernel of truth. And it's a kernel that applies on average to gay men and lesbians, that they are, if you like, on average, gender nonconformist. And you see this in many different ways. If you simply ask gay men and lesbians to sort of place themselves on a scale of femininity, masculinity, a sort of scale of gender properties, if you like, gay men do place themselves on average in a gender nonconformist position. That is, gay men will place themselves more to the feminine end of the spectrum than heterosexual men will. And lesbians place themselves shifted towards the masculine direction compared with heterosexual women. But it's not like they go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. I mean, some people may, but the average gay man, places himself somewhere in the middle, basically about halfway between feminine and masculine, and so do lesbians on average. So there's a kind of big spread or overlap, but the average position is shifted. And then if you look at more specific traits like cognitive traits that differ between the sexes, such as verbal skills, where women typically do better than men, you find that gay men do better than heterosexual men. Lesbians tend to do worse than heterosexual women. If you look at cognitive tasks where men typically outscore women, such as various spatial tasks like mental rotation, rotating an object in space in your mind. There, men typically do better than women. Gay men tend to do worse than heterosexual men. Lesbians tend to do better than heterosexual women. So there's a whole bunch of psychological traits, if you like, where gay people are a little bit gender atypical, or sometimes are very gender atypical compared with their same-sex heterosexual peers.
So again, you think that gender nonconformity produces like a package deal of traits?
Absolutely. I think it absolutely does. And the package, varies from individual to individual. So that's where the stereotyping comes in. If you simply say, gay men are women or something and lesbians are men. I mean, there are some lesbians who are very masculine and actually eventually, want to change sex, like Chastity Bono, who identified as a butch lesbian for many years before she decided that she was more comfortable as a man and wanted to actually change sex and became Chaz Bono. So that's an example of someone who's at that sort of borderland, if you like. But there are many people who are much more comfortable with their birth, many gay people who are much more comfortable with their birth sex, and really identify as, gay men as men and lesbians as women. Nevertheless, if you look in detail at these psychological traits like verbal and spatial skills, you find that gay people as a group really are quite gender nonconformist. And I think it also affects the careers that, the occupational interests that gay people have and the careers they end up in. So that has the result, I think, that gay people really are, contribute to something that's a little bit special in society. That gay people, let's say there comes a day when, being gay is as, unimportant as being left-handed or something like that. I don't think the gay people will just disappear. I think they'll still be really quite relevant in terms of their special talents and special contributions they make to society.
Okay, let's get a little sampler platter of some research in different fields as it relates to sexual orientation. Sex hormones, how do they affect sexual orientation?
Well, there's a large body of animal experiments which say something like this, that the brain, when it's first assembling itself, is kind of neutral in terms of its gender, if you like. And what happens then is that in males, and this I'm talking about during fetal life, in males, rather large levels of male hormones, such as testosterone, are secreted by the male's gonads, by the developing testicles of the male. These circulate in the fetus's blood, enter the brain, and tend to drive the development of the brain in a male-typical direction. And this influences a large package of gender traits, including sexual orientation and these other traits that I mentioned, like spatial skills and verbal skills. In females, typically, testosterone levels are lower, and that allows the brain to follow its own sort of default path of development, if you like, which is a female-typical direction. And so in females, typically, you end up with sexual attraction to males and female-typical gendered characteristics. It seems that in And in animal experiments, this is being shown very clearly that you can influence this whole package of gender characteristics by manipulating the levels of testosterone to which a fetus is exposed. So if you lower testosterone levels in a male fetus, then you somewhat feminize that animal when it's grown up. And conversely, if you add testosterone to a female fetus, you somewhat masculinize its sexual behavior and its other gendered characteristics when it's an adult. And there's some evidence that this is going on in humans too. There are certain medical syndromes where a human fetus is exposed to unusual levels of testosterone. For example, a female fetus that may be exposed to higher levels of testosterone than she otherwise would have been. There's a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, for example, where the adrenal glands pump out much more testosterone than they normally would. And girls with this condition tend to be somewhat masculinized in their childhood behaviors, and when they're adults, they are more likely to experience same-sex attraction and to engage in same-sex relationships than are control groups of women, such as their unaffected sisters. Now, it's definitely not the case that every woman with congenital adrenal hyperplasia is sort of fated to become lesbian. On the contrary, lots of them, but simply are as heterosexual as anyone else. But if you look at the whole population of them, you see a very dramatic shift of the average Kinsey rating, if you like. So that seems like a sort of experiment of nature that says, what's going on in humans might be quite like what you can do experimentally in animals. So this kind of evidence points towards the idea that sex hormones in early life, basically prenatal life, really do have a long-lasting effect on a person's ultimate sexuality when they're adult.
You're tuned into Skeptically Speaking. I'm Desiree Schell, and today I'm talking to Simon LeVay, a British neuroscientist, or was British, best known for a 1991 study in which he reported on a difference in brain structure between gay and straight men. He's the author of the book Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why. Okay, on to genetics. What kind of research is being done into sexual orientation there?
The idea that genes might influence sexual orientation comes originally from family studies. These were initiated by a psychiatrist called Richard Pillard at Boston University, probably about 30 years ago now. And what's being now very clearly shown is that being gay or lesbian really does run in families. If you have one gay person in a family, you're quite likely to find others. You don't always do it, but you quite often do. And what Pillard and other people have done since then is to use twins to try and understand whether this clustering in families is because of environmental effects. Are parents treating a whole bunch of kids in the same family in the same way, such as to drive more than one child towards homosexuality, or are there genes running in certain families that are predisposing multiple individuals to be gay? And on the basis of the twin studies, it seems to be the latter. That is, if you look at identical twins, or so-called identical twins who share basically the same genomes, they are much more likely to share the same sexual orientation than are non-identical or fraternal twins who only share about half their genes in common. And this sort of evidence is what allows you to sort of calculate what's called the heritability of homosexuality, meaning the fraction of the total causation of a person being gay that can be attributed to the genes they inherit. And the numbers vary a bit from study to study, but basically in men it's about 0.5. That is to say, about half of the total reason for a man being gay has to do with the genes that he inherits. With women, it's lower. It's probably about a quarter or perhaps a third of the total reason for a woman being lesbian has to do with the genes she inherits. And it's probably the case that in some families, genes are kind of pretty much all determining. I've seen some family trees where it really looks like a gene is going down through the generations, basically almost like forcing certain individuals to become gay. In other families, genes may play little or no role at all. So, but on average, it seems to be about half the total causation is genetic.
Now, I've heard people say that the idea of passing down gay genes wouldn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. Why would a gene that decreases the chance of reproduction be passed on?
Yes, that's a very reasonable question. Actually, there are plenty of genes that don't seem to favor reproduction that nevertheless get passed on, and usually, let me back off and say first off, we don't know yet whether there are single genes that have very powerful effects, or whether there are a larger number of genes, each of whom's effect might be quite small. So we don't know at this point whether we're really going to be able to identify, the gay gene or a gay gene, or whether it's going to be more, a broad spectrum of genes with weak effects. In any case, genes have multiple effects, and if you have a gene that predisposes, for example, a man to be gay, it may have effects on other members of the family. It may, for example, predispose his sisters to be more than usually attracted to males. If this is a gene for androphilia, for attraction to males, then it might make the man gay, but it might make his sisters, as it were, hyper-heterosexual, make them more fertile because they're more attracted to men having more sex with men. And so the extra reproductive success of these sisters might outweigh the sort of negative effects on the reproduction of the men who are gay. Now, this is just a speculation, if you like, but there is some evidence to support it. There's a couple of Italian studies which have reported that the female relatives of gay men do actually have more offspring than women who don't have any male gay relatives. So that could be the kind of mechanism that's keeping a so-called gay gene in the population. But that's, at this point, just speculation. We won't really know until we have these genes, in a bottle, so to speak, and we really know how they work, when they work in development, what's the difference between the gene in a gay man and a straight man, and so forth.
And we are so close to being out of time, but I really want to get to your field, which is neurology.
Yeah, the brain, yes.
So tell us about the study that I keep mentioning, the 1991 study.
Well, my study you're talking about back in 1991, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, that was a study where an autopsy study where I looked at the brains of gay and straight men and also women whose sexual orientation actually I didn't know. So probably most of them were heterosexual women. And what I found was, yes, a difference in structure in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which does many things for us, but one of the things it does is help regulate our sex lives. And I found a group of cells which typically is larger in males than in females. And this had actually been described previously by a group at UCLA. And what I found was this group of cells was smaller on average in the gay men in my study than in the heterosexual men. So there was a difference looking at people of different sexual orientation of the same sex and not just people of different sexes. And I think that bolsters this hypothesis that there's something different going on when the brain is first assembling itself in fetuses that ultimately become gay than in fetuses that ultimately become straight. And this has been supported now by many other brain studies, including ones that use imaging technology in living people.
Then what does that mean from a structure versus function perspective?
Well, can't give you a definite answer to that, but these parts of the brain in the hypothalamus, on the basis of animal studies, do seem to play a critical role in animal sex behavior. So if you take, for example, a male fetal rat and remove its own source of testosterone so that its sexual behavior is atypical when it grows up, if you examine this part of the brain, this cluster of cells would also be smaller, rather similar to what I found in the gay men. So it's as if whatever the exact function of these cells, they're a kind of label that tells you something about what was going on very early in that person's life. In the animal studies, you have to do these manipulations early. You can't take an adult rat and castrate it, for example, and expect to change its sexual orientation or to change the size of these structures in the brain. It's a sort of sensitive period very early in the animal's life.
We probably don't have time, but I'm going to ask this because it's fascinating. Gaydar. Turns out it's a real thing.
Absolutely. Now, gaydar, it's a slang term meaning ability to tell whether someone is gay or straight without actually asking them, right? And from their appearance, from their behavior, from how they walk, from their voice quality, and that kind of thing. There's lots of studies on gaydar. It works. It's not infallible, but it does work on average. And mostly, gaydar picks up on gender nonconformist behaviors. So voice quality in a man that's a little bit feminine, walking style, these kinds of things. When you see this sort of gender nonconformity, which you may recognize sort of unconsciously, without really, thinking about it, then your suspicion is raised that the person is gay or that the woman is lesbian. And you're not always right, but you're definitely much more often right than on a purely chance basis. So I think this is part of this whole idea that being gay is part of a package of gender variant traits. It's not just who we love. It's also, a broad sort of group of psychological traits.
So now you have delved into a ridiculous amount of research on this topic, honestly, in a good way. So if you could sort of sum up what all of this leads you to in terms of how, I guess, the cause of sexual orientation.
Well, what we can say at this point is that biological factors have a profound influence on a person's sexual orientation. I won't say it's necessarily the whole story, but I do think that there's a lot of evidence now that our genetic inheritance and the hormones that are circulating in our blood when we're fetuses and the way these interact with the developing brain have a very strong effect predisposing us to experience sexual attraction to same-sex or opposite-sex partners or partners of both sexes when we're adult. So I think the biology plays a very significant role both in men and women in influencing their basic sexual feelings.
Sir, I could talk to you for another 3 hours because we have not even scratched the surface, but we have an hour-long time slot. So thank you for being here.
Desiree, thanks so much for having me on your program. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
You'll find links to Simon LeVay and his book, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And we'll be back with Ethan Siegel, theoretical cosmologist, science blogger, and science and health editor at TrapIt, after these messages.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we listen back to an episode that examines the ways society and science inform and influence each other. Frequent guest host Marie-Claire Shanahan, professor of science education at the University of Alberta, discusses how science fits into the broader framework of our common culture. And science writer Mike McRae talks about his book, Tribal Science, Brains, Beliefs, and Bad Ideas, that looks at how brains that evolved to maintain social connections can manage to make objective observations. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, on your local radio station, or online at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm Desiree Schell, and I'm here with Ethan Siegel. Ethan is a theoretical astrophysicist with a PhD in theoretical cosmology from the University of Florida. He's been a science writer since 2008 when he started the fantastic space science blog, Starts With a Bang. His passion is for sharing his knowledge of the world with others and, of course, learning more about it for himself. Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking, Ethan.
Thank you, Desiree. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, back in episode 153, you came on the show to tell us about a project that you were working on, an artificially intelligent news aggregator called TrapIt. So maybe just give people a quick refresher. How does TrapIt work?
Well, normally when you go to the internet and you go to get a news source, like you go to the New York Times News or you go to Google News, there's a disadvantage to that. If you go to just one news source, you get one perspective on an issue, which may or may not be biased, which may or may not be fact-checked. Or if you go to an aggregator like Google News, you're typically getting the same few sources that have been chosen by crowdsourcing as these are your top sources. What you fail to get going to sources like that is the top quality source for whatever it is you're looking for. You fail to get a diversity of content from multiple quality sources that may not have the SEO search rank on their side, that may not have a big name publication behind them. And that's what TrapIt is designed to fix. That's the hard problem that we're seeking to solve. And the way we're doing this is by hand checking all of the news sources, all of the information sources that we come across. We filter out the spam, we filter out the republication content, and we have quality checked by human sources so that we have evaluated what's good for what particular topic. So if you're interested in climate science, in diabetes, in stem cell research, in the latest movie that's out, you put that into our discovery engine, and we're going to create a real-time news stream of content for you. But there's also this extra layer where we have artificial intelligence attached to it, where you get to tell us what do you like, what do you dislike, and we're going to learn from that and deliver you the type of content that you've told us you're interested in. That's what TrapIt is set up to do.
So how's it going then?
It's actually going really well. We've just released our latest iPad build. You can go to trap.it/iPad and get our news app, which is beautiful and works spectacularly. We are currently in the process of upgrading and adding even more sources to what we do. We've got over 100,000 independent feeds coming in that we select from. We're really proud of what we've got.
And now you're on the show today to talk about how you're taking your work at TrapIt in a whole different direction, really. And it's one that I like. So tell us about TrapIt Education.
One of the new things that's sort of come out in this past academic year and the current academic year for the first time is the new Common Core State Standards Initiative in the United States. This is a new set of educational standards. It's replaced No Child Left Behind. And while there will be standardized testing that goes along with that, that's not what I focused on. What I focused on is the fact that, look, there are these reading and writing fundamental standards that are required of students across all subjects and all disciplines. These include, when I'm reading a source, can I check what is the quality of this information? Can I fact check this? Can I evaluate the quality of my source? Can I compare information from multiple sources? And can I synthesize this information to write responsibly on it? This is a problem we all face when we get our news is, hey, there are all these different sources out there. They're reporting on the same story. And they're telling two different takes on it. Who's correct? What's the correct one? How do I separate the factual information, the logically consistent information from someone who's just trying to advance their own agenda, someone who's trying to fit whatever study it is that came out to their own preconceived conclusions? What we're doing with TrapIt Education is we've set up tools, lesson plans, and materials for teachers where they can use what we've created at TrapIt to empower students to create their own news streams, to evaluate their own content, and to develop these skills of, hey, we've got all this information out there. TrapIt's going to find it for us. Now all I have to do is figure out, based on all the different sources it's found, which ones are scrupulous, which ones are unscrupulous, which articles are factual, which ones have counterfactual information in them, and write on them, evaluate them, analyze them, and think about it. These are skills that you would hope everyone would develop in our current information age, and this is maybe the ideal tool to help people get there.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and I'm here with Ethan Siegel, theoretical cosmologist, science blogger, and science and health editor at TrapIt, the artificially intelligent online news aggregator. And we're talking about Ethan's newest project, TrapIt Education. So you wrote an extensive post about this, which we've linked to on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. And in that post, you talked about something called an active engagement lesson. Can you explain what that is?
This is one of the latest educational techniques and I am completely supportive of this. You know, there are plenty of education fads that come and go, but this is one that I think will, first off, be here for a long time because it's so obvious, but also because scientific studies really back up that this is how students learn, not just in the short term, but how they retain information 1, 5, and 10 years down the road. If you can invest a student in a real life situation where they simulate something that they actually will care about in real life, where you put them into a situation where they need to use problem-solving skills to succeed, they're much more likely to retain more information, to learn the material better, and to have that stay with them. So what we've created as far as lesson plan goes are not just these broad outlines, but specific, including subject-specific lesson plans that involve this active engagement techniques. For example, one such lesson puts the student in the position of, you are a researcher for the New York Times on a particular topic. You need to pitch a story to your editor for your section. What story should you pitch on this topic? And you can go and gather the information. You need to separate what are good sources to use for this, what are bad sources to use for this, and why. Can you create a stream of reliable content? And if you can't, are there sources that you would want to ban? And why is that? And so this is an example of a real life lesson where a student would want to use these skills. It's not just saying, we want you to demonstrate that you can do source evaluation. If the student hasn't made clear to them, this is why you do source evaluation, this is how this would be useful to you in the real world, that's a huge positive for the student. It's a huge positive for the teacher. It's a fabulous way for everyone to relate to each other.
Now, how do you plan to go about getting this into classrooms?
Honestly, the way I've been doing it so far is I've been telling teachers that I know about this, and they've been overjoyed to have this available as a resource. I've had teachers in New York use this spontaneously in their classroom, and their kids love it. Their kids report that they feel incredibly organized thanks to the visual interface. They feel like research has suddenly gone from being a chore to being something that they feel comfortable with. I've had this used in a classroom in Pennsylvania where a teacher has made up her own lesson about volcanoes, and the students have received it very positively. And that's something that I'm hopeful I'll be able to make accessible to everyone. Thank you, Christina McCoach, for doing that.
So I know for a fact that we have many teachers that listen to this show. So if they are interested in something like that, how can they find out more?
Well, we can go first off to the link that we've got available on Skeptically Speaking. Honestly, if you really want to know more about it, if you want any assistance with this, my email address is ethan@trapit.com. Just contact me. I'm happy to talk with you about it. If you want to use this in your school, go to trap.it and give it a shot and see if you can use it. There are a few cases I've heard of where school districts have our site blocked by a firewall, but we've got enough examples where just have me give your district a call and they should unblock it. If your school district allows you to use Google, they should allow you to use TrapIt.
Sir, thank you for doing good things.
My pleasure. Always my pleasure to come on the show and tell you about something that I think will make a positive difference in the world.
That is the name of the game, sir. You are always welcome. You'll find links to TrapIt and to Ethan Siegel's blog Starts With a Bang on our website at skepticallyspeaking.com. You'll also find links to Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, which will keep you posted about upcoming shows, and to iTunes, where you can subscribe, listen to past episodes, or leave a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Skeptically Speaking is produced and distributed by Suburban Panic Media. Our studio assistants are Helen Cavillion and Chelsea Butler. Ryan Bromsgrove is our studio technician. The show is edited by K.O. Myers. Our theme song was written and recorded by A.OK. And I'm your host, Desiree Schell.